The morning air carries a chill that seems to seep not through the window pane, but from the floorboards themselves. It is 5 minutes before 5. In the pale gray light that precedes dawn, the world is reduced to textures, the dry grit of unfinished wood beneath bare soles, the sharp metallic taste of stagnant saliva, and the rhythmic, hollow tick of a wall clock whose second hand stutters slightly on every upward stroke. On the dresser rests a mirror, its silver backing flaking away at the corners into jagged black coastlines. Standing before it is a figure whose throat is already raspy. A small notebook lies open beside a ceramic mug of cold tea, its margins crammed with dense, rhythmic handwriting. 500 times yesterday. I am abundance. I am peace. I am whole. The ink has bled into the fibrous paper, creating soft, spider-like crowns around each letter. The lips move. The voice is barely a whisper, yet it carries the heavy, strained friction of a mechanism forced into gear without oil. I am abundant. The syllables fall flat against the glass. The eyes in the reflection do not brighten. They narrow, watchful and exhausted. There is a micro-tension in the jaw, a clenching of the masseter muscle that betrays the performance. The ribcage remains rigid, the breath trapped high in the chest like an animal cornered in an attic. I am abundant. With each repetition, a quiet violence occurs in the silence of the room. The spoken phrase claims fullness, but the empty wallet on the nightstand, the unopened envelope stamped with red ink, and the sudden spasm in the stomach tell an entirely different story. The room does not echo with prosperity, it echoes with the desperate, white-knuckled demand for things to be other than they are. The mirror reflects not a sovereign creator commanding reality into shape, but a prisoner frantically hammering against the cell door, trying to convince the bars that they are made of light. When an individual stands in a quiet room and attempts to force a transformation through sheer repetition, what is actually taking place beneath the surface of the conscious mind? To understand this impasse, one must trace the neural and psychological architecture of effort itself. Consider the recursive nature of desire. Why does a person speak an affirmation? Because they perceive an absence. How do they speak it? With urgency, with insistence, with an underlying terror that if the chant ceases, the reality of lack will swallow them whole. The human nervous system operates as an integrated biological resonance chamber. It cannot be deceived by phonetic sounds. When the vocal cords articulate the word wealth, while the amygdala is concurrently firing distress signals over unpaid debts, the organism registers the spoken word as a threat, a falsehood that must be defended against. The brain's threat detection network perceives a profound split between the internal state of survival and the external performance of triumph. This generates a severe psychological friction known as cognitive dissonance, but with a deeper, somatic consequence. In the attempt to manufacture a positive reality through mental strain, the individual inadvertently reinforces the foundational premise of their suffering: I am currently lacking, and therefore I must labor to become. Every forced visualization, every tense affirmation uttered through gritted teeth, carries a silent, subterranean subtext. The subtext whispers, "This is not here yet. I must generate it because it does not exist." The subconscious mind, which operates not on verbal semantics but on raw physiological state, anchors itself entirely to the subtext. The paradox becomes absolute. The harder the hand grips the chisel to carve out a new life, the deeper it cuts the groove of current inadequacy into the bedrock of identity. Effort, when born from the panic of deficiency, is simply the frequency of deficiency wearing a spiritual mask. The individual is not pulling reality toward themselves, they are pushing against it with the full weight of their unresolved fear. Consider the life of Arthur Vance, an architectural draftsman in the autumn of 1928. Arthur understood the mathematics of stress and load-bearing columns. Yet his own interior life was a crumbling facade. Every evening, beneath the yellow halo of an oil lamp, Arthur opened a leather-bound journal. His company was quietly laying off senior draftsmen. His savings were dissolving into the volatile currents of the pre-crash market. Yet Arthur had encountered the popular metaphysical pamphlets of his era leaflets promising that gratitude was the master key to fortune. Night after night, with trembling fingers, Arthur wrote, "I am deeply grateful for the overflowing prosperity in my household. I am thankful for the absolute security of my position." He forced his mouth into a rigid smile while he wrote, believing that the physical gesture would coax his soul into compliance. But watch Arthur's body as the pen scratches against the rag paper. His shoulders are hitched up toward his ears, locked in a permanent defensive shrug. His left hand grips his knees so tightly that the knuckles turn ivory. His digestive tract is knotted. A dull, persistent burning gnaws at the lining of his stomach. One Tuesday, a younger draftsman was promoted over him. Arthur walked home through the damp, soot-stained streets of Chicago, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped crow. He locked himself in his study, opened the journal, and pressed the nib to the page until the steel split. "I am thankful. I am thankful. I am thankful." A drop of sweat fell from his forehead, smearing the ink into an illegible gray blur. In that precise second, the illusion shattered. Arthur did not feel thankful. He felt terror. He felt a profound, suffocating rage. The forced gratitude had not dissolved his dread, had merely entombed it alive. By denying the reality of his terror, he had given it absolute dominion over his nervous system. The journal had become an altar to his denial. He had spent months repainting a rotted floor beam, smiling as he laid coat after coat of bright varnish over wood that was turning to powder beneath his feet. The collapse of his composure was not caused by the external promotion of his colleague. It was caused by the unbearable pressure of pretending the rot was solid oak. The tragedy of Arthur Vance is the silent tragedy of modern transformation. The belief that reality is a solid, stubborn stone that must be battered into submission by emotional violence. To step out of this self-imposed labyrinth requires an inversion of the entire mechanical model. Reality is not a distant shoreline toward which one must paddle with frantic, exhausting strokes. Nor is it an immovable wall that yields only to the loudest voice or the most prolonged meditation. Human perception acts like a lens submerged in a deep ocean. When the water is violently stirred by the frantic thrashing of hands trying to clear the silt only rises higher, obscuring every ray of light from the surface. The thrashing is the problem. The insistence on seeing clearly is the very force churning the mud. True transformation begins not with the fabrication of an emotional state, but with the quiet cessation of the battle against the present moment. It demands the courage to lower the chisel, to close the notebook, and to stand entirely still before the flaking mirror. What happens when the desperate chant stops? What remains in the room when the vocal cords rest and the jaw relaxes its defensive lock? Beneath the frantic surface of human desire lies an invisible, responsive architecture, a subtle matrix that does not hear the words spoken into the morning air, but registers the stillness behind them. To touch this matrix, one must stop trying to paint the glass. One must understand why the tree does not labor to produce its fruit, and how an entirely different order of consciousness operates just beneath the threshold of ordinary perception. The late afternoon sun slants across the orchard at an acute, dying angle, casting the shadows of skeletal branches into long, reaching fingers across the hardened earth. The soil here is parched, cracked into gray geometric plates that crunch under the weight of an iron boot. A bitter, dry wind moves through the rows, carrying no scent of blossom or damp moss, only the faint, alkaline sting of lime dust. At the center of the third row stands an old winter apple tree. Its bark is split, peeling back like parchment from dry bone. Not a single green bud interrupts the severe, charcoal-colored wood. Yet, hanging from its dead twigs are 3 dozen polished, scarlet apples. A man stands beside the trunk, his breathing labored and loud in the quiet orchard. In his right hand, he grips a wide, heavy-bristled brush, gummy with half-cured animal glue. His left hand holds a crate of fruit bought at dawn from a market 3 towns away. With methodical, trembling precision, he lifts an apple. He slathers the sticky amber paste across the short stem, pushes the fruit against a brittle, sapless branch, and holds it in place. His fingers are stained with resin and dirt. His knuckles ache with the strain of pressing upward against the wood. He counts 60 slow seconds under his breath, waiting for the chemical bond to catch. When he pulls his hand away, the apple stays. It hangs heavy, unnaturally red against the dead gray timber. He takes 2 steps backward to observe his handiwork. From 20 paces away, framed against the amber dusk, the silhouette might deceive a casual traveler on the road. It has the appearance of an orchard in harvest. Then a sudden autumn gust sweeps through the valley. The dry wood does not bend with the wind. It shudders. There is no biological flexibility in the dead limbs, no living vascular fluid to absorb the vibration. One by one, the glued stems tear loose with sharp, dry snaps. The scarlet fruit falls, striking the frozen ruts of the soil with dull, wet thuds, splitting open to reveal pale flesh that immediately begins to brown in the cold air. The man drops to his knees among the bruised fruit. His hands are sticky with glue, crusted with dirt, and entirely empty. Why does an individual exhaust themselves attempting to manufacture elevated emotional states? Because the common consciousness has been conditioned to mistake the fruit for the root. When one asks why joy, peace, or abundance seem so elusive, the typical answer suggests a failure of emotional discipline. One simply did not feel radiant enough, did not hold the vibration high enough, or allowed doubt to contaminate the emotional atmosphere. This diagnosis is built upon a fundamental architectural error. How does an emotion actually arise within the biological and psychological architecture of a human being? An emotion is not an independent engine that can be cranked by willpower. It is an end-stage biological report. It is the downstream chemical translation of an underlying perceptual premise. When light enters the eye, or memory surfaces in the cortex, the brain's perceptual filters process the information through a subterranean matrix of fundamental assumptions. These assumptions are structural. I am safe or I am endangered. I am sovereign or I am deficient. The world is hostile or the world is coherent. Only after the perceptual filter assigns meaning to reality does the hypothalamus signal the pituitary gland, flooding the bloodstream with the corresponding neurochemical cascade. Fear is the chemical signature of a mind that has already accepted its own vulnerability. Joy is the neurochemical resonance of an identity that already perceives its own wholeness. When a seeker attempts to force an elevated vibration by willing themselves into a state of gratitude or excitement while their foundational identity remains rooted in deficiency, they are performing the exact labor of the man in the orchard. They are attempting to glue the biochemical byproduct of wholeness onto an internal structure of lack. The nervous system instantly recognizes the counterfeit. The higher centers of the brain perceive the artificial surge of dopamine or endorphins as an ungrounded anomaly, a frantic masking of an untreated wound. The deeper subconscious mind does not register the artificial smile or the performed cheerfulness. It registers the enormous, terrified effort required to maintain the performance. The downstream effect can never alter the upstream source. To demand that the body produce the neurochemistry of freedom, while the consciousness remains anchored in the identity of a captive, is to ensure perpetual internal war. In the spring of 1962, in a quiet coastal suburb of Edinburgh, a woman named Eleanor Ross operated a boutique interior design studio. Eleanor was renowned for her composure. Her hair was always swept into an impeccable, lacquered twist. Her voice remained an unwavering, melodic calm, even when shipments were lost or clients were venomous. Eleanor had spent years immersed in the self-mastery philosophies that circulated among the post-war European intellectual circles. Her daily code was absolute. Nothing dark may enter. Whenever a creditor's letter arrived with severe terms, Eleanor placed it inside a lacquered box beneath a sprig of dried lavender. She would close her eyes, place her palm flat over her sternum, and forcefully breathe in golden illumination, smiling until the tension behind her temples throbbed like a trapped hornet's nest. When her business partner of a decade quietly siphoned £3,000 from their joint account and vanished on a ferry to Dublin, Eleanor did not weep. She did not raise her voice. That evening, sitting alone in her studio among rolls of raw silk and velvet swatches, she wrote in her notebook, This is merely an invitation for greater prosperity. I bless the departure. I feel only harmony. Look closely into the room as the mantel clock ticks toward midnight. Eleanor's jaw is locked so tightly that the enamel on her back molars has begun to fracture into hairline cracks. Her breath does not reach her diaphragm. It flutters shallowly in her throat, a series of rapid, silent gasps. The skin around her eyes is dry and papery, twitching with involuntary microspasms. She believed she was raising her vibration. In truth, she was burying toxic waste in the cellar of her psyche and pouring sweet perfume over the floorboards. 3 months later, Eleanor's body initiated its own rebellion. Her voice, the very instrument of her curated serenity, vanished. Her vocal cords seized in a state of chronic, spastic dysphonia. The physician who examined her found no viral infection, no structural lesion in the larynx, only a muscular constriction so severe that the vocal folds were pressed together like 2 iron plates under pressure. The body had refused to speak the lies of the mind. By forbidding the natural, messy sorrow and righteous anger of betrayal from moving through her system, Eleanor had frozen those biological energies in place. The unacknowledged reality had not dissolved, it had crystallized in her throat, choking off her capacity to communicate with the world. She had tried to paint the glass of a shattered window, mistaking the bright pigment for structural integrity. The collapse of Eleanor Ross reveals the core deception of superficial transformation. The belief that one can outsmart the mechanics of reality through aesthetic curation. Human awareness does not operate as an isolated spark floating in an inert, dead vacuum. As the early 20th century thinker Florence Scovel Shinn observed with remarkable precision, the individual mind is continuously immersed in an active, responsive medium, a living matrix of energy and intention that functions much like the deep currents of an ocean. This universal matrix does not listen to words, nor does it respond to the brittle varnish of forced positivity. It is entirely indifferent to the slogans printed on notebooks or the smiles held through clenched teeth. The field responds solely to the unedited baseline of consciousness. Consider a radio transmitter submerged in deep water. If the core crystal inside the unit is tuned to static and struggle, wrapping the casing in polished gold or painting it with vibrant colors changes nothing about the signal rippling outward through the water. The surrounding sea registers only the frequency pulse emitted from the core. When the individual ceases the frantic effort to decorate the branches with purchased fruit, an entirely different question emerges. What happens when the brush is set down? The glue is discarded, and the attention is withdrawn from the external appearance of the harvest? Beneath the dried clay of the orchard floor, far below the cracked surface where the wind howls, there lies a subterranean water table, an interconnected reservoir that feeds every root without human strain. To access this reservoir, one must understand how the human instrument actually broadcasts its signature into the responsive fabric of reality, and why the doorway into this conversation does not require hours of exhausting labor, but the precise calibration of a single, unyielding minute. The headlights cut 2 narrow cones of yellow light into the coastal fog, penetrating barely 10 feet before dissolving into a thick, luminous wall of moisture. The sea is invisible below the cliff road, but its presence is unmistakable. A low, percussive roar that vibrates through the steering column and hums inside the bones of the driver's ankles. The cabin of the old automobile smells of damp wool, cold dashboard plastic, and the faint, sweet trace of burned oil. On the passenger seat sits a portable shortwave receiver in a leather-trimmed casing. The dial is illuminated by a tiny amber bulb that buzzes with a high, electrical whine. A gloved hand reaches over, thumb and forefinger closing around the ribbed phenolic knob. The speaker hisses with white noise, the chaotic, oceanic crackle of atmospheric static. As the dial creeps clockwise, fragments of sound tear through the hiss, the garbled cadence of a voice speaking rapid Spanish, a burst of orchestral brass, the rhythmic, metallic pulse of a distant Morse code beacon. The driver turns the volume knob higher, as if sheer decibels could force clarity out of the soup. The static only grows louder, filling the damp cabin with a harsh, abrasive roar that grates against the ears and tightens the muscles along the back of the neck. Then, the dial moves by less than half a millimeter. The roar cuts out entirely. The silence of the carrier wave settles over the car, deep and velvety. Out of that sudden hush emerges a single human voice, speaking from a coastal relay 300 miles south, every syllable crisp, warm, and resting against a backdrop of complete stillness. The driver had not needed to clear the fog. He had not needed to shout into the microphone, or violently shake the receiver to make the southern station appear. The signal was already saturating every cubic centimeter of the misty air, moving through the steel body of the car, through the glass, through the driver's own chest. It was entirely present all along. The problem had never been the power of the broadcast, it had been the precision of the tuner. Why does an individual spend decades shouting intentions into the void while receiving only the echo of their own frustration? The answer lies in the fundamental nature of correspondence. The human mind typically conceptualizes manifestation as a logistical problem. An intention is formulated here, at point A, and through sustained mental strain, it must travel across space and time to arrive at point B, dragging an external circumstance along with it. This model is a perceptual delusion born from the physical mechanics of the macro world. How does the underlying matrix of reality actually operate? The living field that envelops conscious experience does not function like a postal system. It behaves like a vast, non-local quantum medium, where every point is in instantaneous, continuous contact with every other point. There is no distance to bridge. There is no lag between the emission of a frequency and the field's reorganization around it. The illusion of delay arises because human beings rarely broadcast a clean, uninterrupted signal. Consider what occurs when a person sits down to hold an intention for an expanded life. For 3 seconds, they picture freedom. But in the 4th second, the mind glances sideways at the bank account and tightens with worry. In the 7th second, an old memory of childhood criticism surfaces, accompanied by a subtle drop in the stomach. In the 12th second, the individual wonders if the technique is working, introducing a ripple of doubt and impatience. Within 15 seconds, the signal has shifted dozens of times, oscillating wildly between sovereignty, deficiency, fear, and performance. The field does not fail to respond. It responds with microscopic, merciless accuracy to the average sum of that chaotic broadcast. It returns a life that reflects precisely what was emitted. An inconsistent, fragmented reality marked by sporadic glimpses of progress buried beneath recurring waves of stagnation. The field does not answer what is spoken aloud, nor what is painted on a board of dreams. It mirrors the exact tonal signature of the state one inhabits when the conscious mind drops its guard. In the winter of 1974, a clinical researcher named Dr. Martin Graves found himself stranded in an unheated basement laboratory at a university in the north of England. His 6-year study on cellular regeneration had hit a definitive dead end. The tissue cultures were repeatedly collapsing before mitosis could complete. Graves was a man possessed by intellectual desperation. His laboratory was a visual ledger of strain. Towering stacks of typed papers, with angry red strike-throughs, rings of dried coffee on the edge of every work surface, and the sour smell of stale pipe tobacco embedded in his wool cardigan. For 14 months, Graves had worked 14-hour days, forcing his eyes through the microscope until his retinas burned, furiously calculating new biochemical formulas. He approached the problem like a siege engineer trying to break through a stone redoubt. He demanded results from the universe with every fiber of his exhausted intellect. The cells continued to die within 36 hours of plating. On a freezing Thursday evening, having received a formal notice that his research funding would terminate at the end of the month, Graves reached a point of absolute biological surrender. Frantic inner narrator, the voice that had spent years scheming, demanding, and despairing simply collapsed under the weight of its own fatigue. He did not pray, he did not visualize success, he did not write affirmations in his notebook. He leaned back in his oak swivel chair, let his hands drop limp onto his lap, and closed his eyes. The room was freezing, the wind rattling the high, narrow basement windows. For the first time in 6 years, Martin Graves stopped arguing with the reality of his failure. He allowed the total weight of the present moment to settle into his bones. His breathing, usually shallow and ragged, dropped into a slow, rhythmic cadence. He sat in that deep, spacious neutrality for 60 uninterrupted seconds. In that minute of complete internal non-resistance, his mind stopped generating the static of panic. When he opened his eyes, he did not rush back to the microscope. He stood up slowly, walked to the corner of the lab to fetch his overcoat, and his gaze happened to fall upon a neglected, uncalibrated incubator in the shadows beneath the stairs, a machine he had walked past 1,000 times without seeing. A thought moved through his awareness, quiet as a falling leaf. The temperature fluctuation is not linear, it is cyclical. He walked over, inspected the old thermostat with detached curiosity, and realized in an instant what 6 years of manic intellectual effort had obscured. The cooling cycles of the laboratory were syncing with the building's central heating timers, introducing microshocks to the cultures during the midnight switchover. The answer had not been hidden by the complexity of the science. It had been hidden by the dense, blinding fog of his own cognitive desperation. The moment the internal storm ceased, the obvious emerged from the shadows. The breakthrough experienced by Dr. Graves was not an accident of fate, nor was it a stroke of arbitrary cosmic fortune. It was the predictable mathematical outcome of an internal clearing. The human instrument possesses an innate capacity to alter its resonance in an instant, yet modern culture has convinced the seeker that profound transformation requires an eternity of arduous labor. This belief is the ultimate defense mechanism of the conditioned self, a strategy designed to postpone the terrifying simplicity of the present moment. One does not need to hold an enlightened state for years, months, or even hours to begin altering the trajectory of experience. The doorway to recalibration is remarkably narrow, yet infinitely deep. It requires holding a single, uncorrupted frequency of conscious awareness for exactly 60 seconds. 60 seconds of genuine, unpolluted coherence, where the mind does not look over its shoulder to check for results, where the body does not brace against what is, and where the attention rests entirely in the open space of the present, acts as an energetic reset button for the entire biological and perceptual apparatus. It is a minute stripped clean of performance, no chance, no forced smiles, no violent demands for the future to arrive early. When this threshold is crossed, the nervous system ceases its frantic defensive scanning, and the perceptual filters begin to widen. The static recedes, and the subtle architecture of reality starts to become visible. Yet before this 60-second alignment can be embodied in daily life, one must confront the single most deceptive trap in the entire landscape of personal growth. A modern spiritual orthodoxy that sounds like liberation but quietly builds an invisible cage around the human soul. The white ceramic surface reflects the harsh, fluorescent glow of an open-plan office at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. Stamped across the glaze in thick, cheerful, golden typography is a phrase that has colonized millions of storefronts, screens, and apparel items across the modern world: good vibes only. Beside the mug sits a woman whose hand is shaking with a quiet, imperceptible tremor. The steam rising from the black coffee carries the bitter, roasted scent of cheap chicory, but the woman does not taste it. Her fingernails, filed into neat, immaculate ovals, press into the soft flesh of her opposite palm under the edge of the desk deep enough to leave half-moon impressions that turn white before flushing crimson. Her phone rests face up on the laminate wood. On the glass screen, a single notification glows with cold clarity. A message detailing a medical diagnosis that will alter her family's trajectory forever. Around her, the office hums with the sterile rhythm of air conditioning and mechanical keyboard clicks. A colleague walks by, tossing a casual greeting over the partition. "Morning, Sarah, looking radiant today." Watch the muscles around Sarah's mouth. They contract instantly, pulling the lips back into a bright, symmetrical, enamel-bearing smile that never reaches the dry, dilated pupils of her eyes. "Always good," her voice chirps, ringing at a pitch 2 octaves higher than her natural speaking register. Inside her chest, an entirely different architecture is collapsing. The diaphragm has locked into an iron plate. The blood vessels along her neck pulse with a high, acidic heat. Her stomach is a cold knot of nausea and panic. Yet, as she turns back to her monitor, she catches sight of the golden slogan on her mug. A wave of intense, suffocating shame immediately floods her nervous system. She scolds herself viciously beneath her breath. Do not dwell on this. Do not lower your frequency. Attract only the light. She takes a scalding sip of coffee, swallows the hot liquid over a throat tight with unshed tears, and forces her back into an upright, triumphant posture. The mug smiles up at her, an innocent executioner enforcing a regime of total internal exile. What takes place within the human organism when an individual embraces the doctrine that only pleasant emotions are spiritually permissible? To comprehend this insidious trap, one must trace the physiological and cognitive phenomenon of emotional stacking. Consider the recursive anatomy of a feeling. When life introduces a sudden shock, a profound loss, or an acute betrayal, the human body naturally generates a primary emotional response. Sadness, grief, fear, or anger rise through the nervous system as raw, biological tides, visceral information signals designed to process impact and clear somatic pathways. Why does modern spirituality turn this natural biological process into a catastrophe? Because the dogma of manufactured positivity introduces a catastrophic second layer, the moral evaluation of the primary emotion. When a person feels fear or grief and immediately evaluates that feeling as a spiritual failure, a low vibrational error that will inevitably manifest destruction in their external reality, the mind creates a dense secondary reaction. The individual is no longer merely experiencing the clean, primary sorrow of a loss. They are now experiencing sorrow, plus guilt for feeling sorrow, plus panic that the sorrow will ruin their future, plus self-loathing for failing to maintain enlightenment. This structural stacking creates an internal civil war. The original emotion was simply a transient wave, requiring only 60 to 90 seconds of open, unobstructed biological movement to deliver its neurochemical message and naturally dissipate. But when judgment and suppression clamp down upon it, the wave is trapped within the tissue of the body. The energy that could have moved freely through the organism becomes calcified into chronic tension. The individual has not raised their vibration by a single fraction of a hertz. They have merely weaponized their own intellect against their biology, turning their conscious awareness into an armed guard policing the cellar of their own heart. In the winter of 1912, inside a stone sanatorium nestled on the outskirts of the Black Forest, a young physician named Dr. Heinrich Richter was assigned to a ward of patients suffering from what was then catalogued as intractable melancholic hysteria. Among them was an engineer named Paul Meyer, a man who had spent 3 decades designing railway bridges across the Rhine. Meyer had survived a catastrophic collapse of a suspension span 5 years prior, an accident that had claimed the lives of 11 workmen. Yet, in the 5 years following the disaster, Meyer had never wept. He had never spoken of the collapse with anything other than cool, detached technical curiosity. Meyer was, by his own proud description, an absolute master of mental fortitude. When other survivors fell into bouts of public lamentation, Meyer lectured them on the necessity of steel nerves and optimistic resolve. Yet here he sat in the Black Forest, unable to digest solid food, his skin yellowed and his limbs racked by phantom tremors that defied every neurological examination. Richter discarded the traditional cold water baths and electric stimulation therapies of his contemporaries. Instead, on a freezing Tuesday in January, Richter led Meyer into an unadorned room with 2 wooden chairs and a single iron wood stove. Richter sat across from the engineer, looked directly into his guarded, sunken eyes, and spoke with quiet finality. Herr Meyer, you are not permitted to be strong in this room. For the next hour, you are forbidden to look on the bright side of your ruined bridge. For 10 minutes, the room was suffocated by silence. The wood in the stove hissed, releasing the sharp, resinous smell of burning pine. Meyer sat like a statue carved from limestone, his chin held high, his jaw set in its habitual posture of unyielding defiance. Then Richter leaned forward and tapped Meyer's chest lightly with 2 fingers right over the sternum. "Who is screaming behind this iron plate, Paul?" The engineer's face twitched. A hairline fracture appeared in the porcelain mask of his composure. Meyer opened his mouth to offer an intellectual explanation, but the air caught in his throat. His shoulders began to tremble. Within moments, the entire architecture of his 5-year performance collapsed. Meyer doubled over in his chair, his forehead resting on his knees, and let out a sound so raw, so guttural, that the nursing staff in the corridor paused in their duties. He wept not for minutes, but for an hour, a violent, torrential release of 5 years of unacknowledged horror, survivor's guilt, and grief for the 11 men whose names he had memorized and buried. He did not drown in the sorrow did not destroy him. When Meyer finally lifted his head, the phantom tremors in his hands had ceased entirely. His breathing had dropped deep into his belly for the first time since the bridge fell. By allowing the dark messenger through the front door, the ghost had delivered its warning and vanished into the winter air, leaving the house of the body quiet and restored. The Lesoswin, etched into the recovery of Paul Meyer, reveals the profound flaw at the heart of modern spiritual escapism. Healing does not occur through the eradication of shadow, but through the courage to meet the shadow without defense. When an individual stops treating difficult feelings as cosmic hazards and begins listening to them as diagnostic guides, the exhausting cycle of spiritual self-policing dissolves. Fear is not an enemy that must be hunted down and eradicated with an affirmation. It is a frightened child within the nervous system pointing toward an old wound that needs the stabilizing presence of sovereign awareness. True sovereignty does not mean inhabiting a permanent, manic high. It means having the emotional range and internal spaciousness to allow every frequency of human experience to move through consciousness without losing one's footing as the witness. To those who have walked this exhausting path of spiritual perfectionism, who have spent years policing their internal landscape, terrified that a single dark thought or honest tear would shatter their reality, there comes a moment where the weight must be set down. If this journey of untangling the illusions of consciousness and uncovering how transformation truly operates resonates with the deeper truth you have always sensed, pause here. Take a breath, subscribe to walk alongside this unfolding inquiry, and leave a mark of your presence so this work finds those still trapped behind polished masks. For once, the demand to feel only the light is surrendered, the internal terrain clears. With the battlefield vacated, the mind becomes ready to look upon a far more precise map, one that reveals the exact spectrum of frequencies that govern human perception, and the hidden turning point where an individual stops surviving and begins to consciously sculpt the fabric of their reality. The corridor stretches 30 yards into deep shadow, its ceiling lost in damp, soot-stained timber beams. The only light enters through a narrow transomed window at the far end, filtering down in a pale, dusty rectangle that barely illuminates the floorboards. The air smells of dry rot, cold slate, and the faint, sweet trace of forgotten camphor. A traveler moves along the wall with halting, tentative steps. His hands are outstretched, fingers splayed against the wainscoting, knuckles scraping against uneven nails. Over his eyes rests a pair of heavy brass-rimmed spectacles, fitted not with clear crystal, but with thick discs of smoke-stained obsidian. Through these dark lenses, the architecture of the hallway is reduced to an impenetrable monochrome. Every threshold appears as a solid stone partition. Every recessed archway reads as an impassable dead end. To his fingers, the wood feels rough and threatening, each knot a sharp edge waiting to tear the skin. Along both flanks of the corridor, brass handles and iron latches gleam faintly in the gloom, completely unlatched. Doors stand ajar by 2 or 3 inches, opening into sunlit solariums, libraries filled with open books, and courtyards scented with damp boxwood and rain. Yet the traveler sees none of them. He pauses before a heavy oak door left half an inch off its latch. He reaches out, his palm striking the thick wood of the panel instead of the handle. He presses his full weight against it, with a low, ragged groan, mistaking the door for a sealed pillar. He drops his forehead against the cold wood, chest heaving with exhaustion, whispering to the dark air that there is no way forward, that the hallway is a tomb designed solely to deny him passage. He is not trapped by the timber or the iron hinges. He is imprisoned entirely by the glass through which he attempts to navigate the dark. Why does an individual walk past open doors and perceive only reinforced barriers? The mechanism lies in the hidden calibration of the human perceptual spectrum. Consciousness does not function as an objective camera, recording neutral data from the external environment. It operates as a dynamic tuning fork, selecting and amplifying only the bandwidth of reality that corresponds precisely to its current operating state. Consider the recursive anatomy of survival frequencies. How does an organism experience the world from the depths of shame, guilt, or apathy? When consciousness operates below the threshold of courage, the nervous system is locked in an ancient, involuntary survival protocol. In states of deep shame or chronic guilt, the neurological apparatus interprets the self as fundamentally defective or dangerous. The brain's salience network, the biological mechanism responsible for determining what deserves conscious attention, adjusts its filters to detect only threats, rejections, and confirmations of inadequacy. Why can a person in this state not think positively into a different outcome? Because the intellect cannot build a reality using data its perceptual filters have already systematically discarded. To someone anchored in the frequency of fear, an unexpected financial windfall does not register as abundance. It registers as an impending tax burden or a setup for catastrophic loss. An authentic offer of love does not feel like intimacy. It feels like an imminent trap waiting to expose their unworthiness. The external world does not deny them relief. The baseline frequency simply renders the relief invisible. Below the threshold of courage, every event is filtered through the lens of defense. The organism spends its entire metabolic budget bracing against an anticipated blow, mistaking the tension of its own muscles for the pressure of a hostile universe. In the late autumn of 1941, deep within the limestone quarry networks outside Bristol, a mining engineer named Thomas Callow was tasked with mapping abandoned subterranean drainage shafts to protect an underground munitions reserve. Callow was a man consumed by the precise mathematics of disaster. 3 years earlier, a catastrophic roof fall in a northern pit had buried his younger brother, an event that left Thomas with a persistent, cold tremor in his left hand and a habit of checking support timbers until the skin on his thumbs was raw. He descended into the shafts with a heavy brass carbide lamp, its flame-throwing flickering, amber light against the sweating rock faces. On a Tuesday afternoon, 400 feet below the limestone surface, a sudden settling of the upper strata sheared the timber props behind him. A deafening roar of falling rock echoed down the tunnel, followed by an impenetrable cloud of white limestone dust that choked his throat and extinguished his carbide flame. When the dust settled, Thomas was encased in absolute, velvet darkness. His first reaction was the automatic surge of terror. The diaphragm seized, his breath came in rapid, shallow wheezes, and his mind raced through vivid images of slow suffocation in the dark. For 20 minutes, he crawled on his knees, frantically beating his raw palms against the jagged wall of fallen rock, screaming until his throat burned with the taste of copper. He was trapped below the line of courage, a captive of the panicked animal within his nervous system. Then, his hand struck a jagged piece of slate, cutting deep into his palm. The sharp, physical sting broke the loop of hysteria. Thomas sat back on the stone floor, pulled his knees to his chest, and stopped moving. He placed his bloody hand flat against the cold slate. He allowed the absolute reality of the dark to enter his senses without fighting it. He stopped demanding that the cave-in unhappen. He stopped screaming at the stone. For 60 slow seconds, he breathed in the cold, mineral-heavy air, dropping beneath the frantic calculations of the mind into a state of stark, neutral awareness. I am here. The rocks have fallen. The air is limited. What is the next true action? The moment the terror subsided, his auditory perception expanded dramatically. Through the dense silence of the collapsed cavern, beneath the sound of his own pulse, he heard something he had missed entirely during his 20 minutes of panic: the faint, rhythmic trickle of moving water 60 yards to his left. Water meant an active fissure. A fissure meant a channel cut through the stone toward the river valley above. He stood up in the pitch black, no longer thrashing against the impassable wall of rock. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, his fingers tracing the sound of the subterranean stream, he navigated the unmapped crevice and emerged 2 hours later into the wet grass of the gorge under an open evening sky. The salvation of Thomas Callow did not occur when he found the exit. It occurred the moment he crossed the internal threshold from panic to courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, nor is it a manufactured bravado shouted into the darkness. It is the precise moment consciousness ceases to defend itself against the present circumstance and agrees to see reality as it actually is. It is the fulcrum upon which the entire human experience pivots. Above this pivotal threshold, the biological and energetic landscape undergoes an immediate metamorphosis. The vascular system opens, the prefrontal cortex reclaims executive function from the alarm centers of the midbrain. The salience network widens its aperture, allowing entirely new bands of information to enter conscious awareness. When an individual shifts from surviving a circumstance to meeting it with sovereign courage, the world does not magically transform into a fantasy. Rather, the smoke-stained lenses fall away. The open doors that were always present along the corridor become visible. Synchronicities cease to be rare, mystical interventions, and become the ordinary currency of daily life. Solutions that were previously obscured by the blinding static of panic appear as obvious, natural pathways that had simply been waiting for an observer capable of perceiving them. Yet to hold this elevated perspective consistently, one must confront a subtle, deceptive territory within the self, the hidden, unedited assumptions that operate when the conscious mind believes no one is watching. The porcelain basin in the bathroom is cold beneath the palms. It is 11:30 at night, and the single unshaded incandescent bulb overhead buzzes with an insect-like hum, casting sharp, unflattering shadows across the white tile. The sound comes suddenly from the kitchen downstairs, a sharp, sickening crash of breaking stoneware, followed immediately by the dull thud of something heavy striking the pine floor. Watch the human body in the precise fraction of a second before thought arranges itself into language. The shoulders jump toward the ears. The spine curls inward by a fraction of an inch, an ancient reflex curling the torso to protect soft viscera. The breath does not merely pause, it is violently swallowed, held captive behind a clamped glottis. In that microscopic sliver of time before any curated philosophy can step forward, before any spiritual affirmation can be recalled, the raw biological baseline exposes itself. A sour flush of heat rushes into the neck. The teeth grind together with a dry, audible click. A voice fires in the dark corridors of the mind, fast and venomous. Who ruined this now? Why does this always happen to me? Then, 3 seconds later, the conscious intellect rushes to the scene like an embarrassed stagehand. The shoulders are deliberately lowered. A practiced breath is forced through nostrils that flare with residual tension. The mouth arranges itself into an expression of stoic calm, and the mind recites, "Everything happens for a reason. Peace is within." The performance has resumed, but the mirror of the bathroom tiles captured the truth. The unedited reflects the instant of blame, the surge of grievance, the bitter assumption of victimization revealed the true resident of the house. The spiritual vocabulary was merely a decorative coat of paint applied over an unhealed fracture. Why does the external world consistently mirror an individual's hidden anxieties rather than their most articulate desires? The answer lies in the radical difference between conscious intention and the subterranean frequency of baseline expectation. Human beings operate under the comforting illusion that reality listens to what they deliberately present to the world, the carefully assembled vision boards, the whispered morning intentions, the curated conversations over dinner. This assumption fails to grasp how the nervous system communicates with the larger field of experience. Consider the recursive mechanics of belief. What is a belief? It is not an intellectual idea one agrees with. It is a neurological and perceptual habit that has become entirely invisible to the one who holds it. How does this hidden structure broadcast its signature? When a person consciously visualizes financial freedom, yet harbors an unexamined, subterranean conviction that they are fundamentally unworthy, or that safety lies only in struggle, the field does not register the visualization. It registers the baseline. The baseline is the unedited reflex, the feeling that arises when the mail arrives, the subtle dread that tightens the throat when the phone rings unexpectedly, the silent envy that flares when a peer succeeds. Why is this broadcast so difficult to intercept? Because the human ego possesses an extraordinary capacity for self-deception. It defends its own survival by dressing old wounds in the sophisticated garments of spiritual evolution. It claims to be practicing acceptance while secretly nursing a grievance. It claims to trust the universe while frantically checking every corner for betrayal. Until an individual is willing to observe the raw, ugly, unpolished reflex without reaching for an excuse or a spiritual bandage, the shadow broadcast continues uninterrupted, quietly arranging the external landscape to match the secret architecture of their deepest fear. In the winter of 1954, in a gray stone townhouse on the edge of Boston, a classical cellist named Julian Mercer prepared for the audition that would determine his seat in the Metropolitan Symphony. Julian possessed flawless technique. His fingers moved across the ebony fingerboard with the precision of a master watchmaker, and his tone was rich, dark, and resonant. Yet for 7 years, in every major audition, Julian had faltered at the exact same measure of the Elgar Concerto, a rapid shift into the high register where his bow would skip, producing a harsh, choked screech that broke the melodic line. Julian was a student of modern autosuggestion. Every night before sleeping, he sat beside his instrument case, closed his eyes, and repeated, "My hands are steady. My art is recognized. I belong on the grand stage." On the morning of the audition, an elderly violin maker named Klaus Lindner, a man who had repaired instruments for 4 decades and possessed an uncanny ear for human tension, sat in the back of Julian's practice room. Julian began to play. He moved through the opening phrases with impeccable grace, but as the difficult passage approached, Lindner stood up and sharply slapped his palm against the wooden work table. The cello fell silent. Julian blinked, irritated and breathless. "Why did you stop me, Klaus?" "I was in perfect tempo." Lindner walked slowly across the floorboards, his heavy leather apron creaking. He did not look at the sheet music, he looked at Julian's left shoulder. "Play the opening again," Lindner said softly. "Do not play the notes. Watch what your body does the moment you lift the bow." Julian raised the instrument. Before the horsehair even touched the string, Lindner pointed a blunt finger at Julian's collarbone. The muscle there was drawn up and rigid, bracing against an invisible blow. "Tell me the truth, Julian," Lindner whispered. "Whose voice enters this room the moment you lift the bow?" Julian opened his mouth to defend his professionalism, but the words withered. The unshaded morning light revealed the sudden pallor of his skin. The unedited truth, buried beneath 7 years of positive affirmations and technical drills, surfaced like an ancient wreck from deep water. "My father," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dry rasp. "He said a Mercer does not make a living with music. He said I would starve on the streets." Julian had spent 7 years chanting affirmations of triumph, but his biology remained loyal to an unconscious contract made with a dead man at the age of 12. The screech in the high register was not a technical failure, it was a somatic guarantee that he would remain obedient to his father's prophecy. He did not fear failure, he feared the terrifying freedom of succeeding beyond the boundary of his family's permission. The revelation in Julian Mercer's practice room strips away the ultimate vanity of the spiritual seeker, the belief that one can transcend limitation without first acknowledging its roots. To encounter the mirror of truth is not an act of self-condemnation. It is the beginning of genuine liberation. When an individual discovers a hidden pocket of resentment, panic, or unworthiness within themselves, the instinct is often to immediately attack it, to replace it with a new mantra, to drown it in manufactured gratitude, or to explain it away through psychological analysis. Every defense only reinforces the wall. What occurs when the defense is entirely dropped? When the unedited reflex is met not with panic or self-loathing, but with the cool, unblinking presence of a scientist observing an organism under a microscope, the moment one stops defending why the wound is there, the wound loses its power to direct the nervous system from the dark. The question shifts from, "How do I fix this broken piece of myself?" to a far more profound inquiry. Who is the one observing this broken piece without being broken by it? This radical neutrality alters the entire internal chemistry. It dismantles the unconscious agreements that have quietly governed decisions, relationships, and boundaries for decades. Yet, as this psychological armor begins to loosen, a startling question arises from the frontier where ancient philosophy meets the physical sciences. Is this internal landscape purely mental? Or does the conscious choice to observe reality actually restructure the physical universe at the level of atoms, cells, and light? A dust mote floats through a single diagonal shaft of afternoon sunlight, hovering in the cold stillness of an empty library. To the naked human eye, the room is mostly empty space. The oak reading table appears impenetrable, a dense, unyielding slab of dark timber polished with linseed oil, its grain cool and unmoving beneath a resting hand. The limestone walls seem permanent, thick enough to muffle the roar of the city outside to a distant, submerged murmur. The air feels clear, a transparent void through which bodies move without resistance. Yet place a thumb upon the polished oak table and slow down the scale of perception by a billionfold. The solid timber dissolves into an immense, cavernous cosmos of vibrating energy. The atoms that form the wood are not tiny billiard balls packed together. They are vast, empty cathedrals of force fields. If the nucleus of one of those carbon atoms were enlarged to the size of a marble resting in the center of the library floor, its electrons would be spinning like erratic specks of dust in the streets 3 blocks away. Between the nucleus and the electron lies nothing tangible, only the silent tension of an invisible field. More humbling still is the biological aperture through which the observer looks. The human retina is tuned to receive a razor-thin ribbon of the electromagnetic spectrum, roughly 400 to 700 nanometers. Above that minuscule band soar the towering waves of infrared, microwave, and radio. Below it plunge ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma radiation. The human senses register less than 5% of the physical light saturating the very air in the room. An entire ocean of luminous information, dynamic geometries, and living frequencies washes through the skin, through the skull, and through the floorboards every microsecond, completely undetected by the nervous system. The ordinary human assumption that reality consists exclusively of what can be touched, seen, or knocked against with an iron knuckle is not just an error of philosophy, it is a profound biological hallucination. Why does the material world appear so stubbornly fixed if its fundamental nature is fluid and energetic? The answer lies in the recursive feedback loop between conscious attention and neural architecture. When an individual asks how an internal state can influence the tangible conditions of a life, the inquiry often stumbles into mystical abstraction. Yet the bridge between awareness and matter is written directly into the biology of the brain. Consider the recursive mechanics of perception. How does consciousness translate an energetic universe into a physical life? The brain does not record the world. It actively constructs a predictive model of it. When a person habitually inhabits a state of chronic defense, resentment, or scarcity, the brain's neural circuits fire in repetitive, synchronized sequences. Through the relentless biological law of neuroplasticity, the synapses that fire together wire together. Dendritic trees thicken. Myelin sheaths wrap tightly around the familiar highways of fear and reaction, lowering the electrical resistance along those specific pathways. Conversely, the neural pathways associated with creative synthesis, broad-spectrum perception, and sovereign stillness begin to prune away from disuse. The brain physically hardens into an organ designed exclusively to confirm the old reality. Why is this biological truth so vital to understand? Because matter at the subatomic scale does not collapse into form through passive drifting. The quantum observer effect reveals that the state of the measurement apparatus determines how an energetic wave resolves into a localized particle. The brain is that measurement apparatus. When consciousness shifts its operating state even for 60 seconds of deep, non-reactive observation, it interrupts the automatic firing of the conditioned neural loop. In that single, suspended minute, the electrical voltage of the brain changes. Cortisol levels begin their biological descent, heart rate variability shifts toward coherent rhythm, and the nervous system stops carving the old groove into the physical flesh. Consciousness does not merely think about biology. Consciousness is the architect that continuously builds, prunes, and commands biological form. In the winter of 1982, inside a specialized stroke rehabilitation clinic outside Zurich, a 48-year-old watchmaker named Stefan Vane sat before a green baize table. 6 months prior, a localized ischemic event in his right motor cortex had left his left hand completely paralyzed. The limb rested on the baize like a dead weight of cold tallow, the fingers curled inward into a rigid, claw-like fist that had resisted months of conventional physical manipulation. Stefan's livelihood, his identity, and the delicate art of assembling microscopic balance wheels and hairsprings had vanished in an instant. His therapist, an unorthodox neurologist named Dr. Clara Weidman, removed the mechanical braces from Stefan's arm and placed a heavy wooden board between his hands, shielding the paralyzed left hand from his view. She placed an identical mirror facing his functional right hand. "Do not attempt to move the left fingers, Stefan," Dr. Weidman instructed, her voice calm and absolute in the quiet examination room. "Look only into the mirror. Watch your right hand open and close, and for 60 seconds at a time, hold the precise sensation of your left hand performing that movement in complete freedom." Stefan stared into the glass. In the reflection, his right hand unfolded slowly, the fingers extending in smooth, graceful arcs. But because of the mirror's angle, his brain received the direct, unvarnished visual input that his left hand was opening with absolute fluid grace. For the first 4 days, the exercise felt like a cruel absurdity. Stefan's forehead beaded with sweat, the muscles along the back of his neck burned with the strain of holding his attention steady. Every time his conscious mind whispered, "This is an illusion. The hand is dead," his attention would fracture, and the therapeutic window would slam shut. On the 5th day, Stefan stopped fighting the mirror. He settled into the chair, dropped his shoulders, and allowed his awareness to rest entirely in the reality of the reflected movement. For 60 uninterrupted seconds, his consciousness held no doubt, no panic, no frantic demand for healing. He inhabited the pure, uncorrupted sensation of fluid movement. Beneath the skull, in the dark, silent folds of Stefan's damaged cortex, something extraordinary was taking place. Deprived of the old visual feedback of paralysis, and guided by 60 seconds of unwavering, focused attention, the brain began bypassing the necrotic tissue of the old stroke site. Dormant auxiliary pathways across the motor stripe fired electrical impulses across newly bridged synapses. On the 8th day, while Stefan held that quiet, focused state before the mirror, the dead tallow of his real left hand stirred, the index finger uncurled by 1/8 of an inch. Within 3 weeks, the neural circuitry had rebuilt itself so extensively that the hand could pick up a brass watch gear without trembling. The physical structure of his brain had restructured its own matter not through brute force, but through the sustained, coherent command of focused consciousness. The restored hands of Stefan Vane offer a living demonstration of a principle that shatters the foundation of mechanical materialism. The body is not an unchangeable machine that dictates the limits of awareness. It is the physical printout of where awareness has been trained to look. When an individual realizes that 95% of reality is an unseen field of living potential and that the nervous system is a pliable, listening instrument, the old strategies of struggle become obsolete. One does not need to wage a violent war against the flesh, against past trauma, or against external limitations. The work is far cleaner, far more precise. It consists of stepping out of the automated machinery of unconscious reaction and taking one's seat as the conscious observer. When the shift is made, the brain ceases to be a prison of past conditioning and becomes what it was always intended to be, a dynamic biological loom weaving new pathways, new perceptions, and new physical possibilities into existence, yet this realization brings the seeker to the ultimate threshold of the journey. If the brain is merely the instrument, and the thoughts and emotions are merely electrical currents moving through the biological wiring, then who is the one watching the entire display? Who is the silent presence standing behind the machinery of the mind, completely untouched by the storms that rage across the surface of the nervous system? At 4 in the afternoon, over the high plains of New Mexico, the atmosphere curdles into the color of bruised iron, the wind drops to a dead, suffocating standstill. On the wooden porch of an isolated weather station, the humidity hangs so heavy that the raw cedar railings feel damp and sticky to the touch. The scent in the air is sharp and primordial. Ozone, scorched dust, and the cold, metallic breath of descending hail. 10 miles to the west, a supercell cloud formation rises 30,000 feet into the troposphere. It is an engine of terrifying kinetic violence. Within its dark, rotating anvil, billions of tons of supercooled water churn in violent updrafts, while jagged veins of violet lightning split the belly of the cloud with deafening, chest-rattling concussions. Below, the prairie grass flattens under sudden downdrafts. Dust devils spiral across the arid flats, tearing dry sagebrush from its roots and hurling it against the barbed wire fences. The earth braces, shudders, and weeps under the sheer weight of the assault. Yet raise the gaze 5 miles above the turbulent anvil. Above the jagged crown of the thunderhead lies an ocean of pure, crystalline blue. Here, the temperature is -60 degrees, and the air is completely silent. Not a single molecule of the storm touches this expanse. The lightning does not scar the sky. The thunder does not leave a bruise on the atmosphere. The sky does not fight the tempest, nor does it plead with the dark clouds to disperse. It simply offers infinite, unyielding space for the storm to rage, exhaust its charge, and dissolve back into nothingness. When the storm finally spends itself, leaving the red dirt soaking and the ravines overflowing with muddy runoff, the sky remains precisely as it was before the first vapor condensed, immaculate, untouched, and utterly indifferent to the violence that took place within its embrace. Why does an individual spend an entire lifetime feeling battered by the emotional turbulence of daily experience? The suffering persists because the conscious mind makes a fatal error of identification. It mistakes itself for the storm rather than the sky. When fear tightens the stomach, the individual declares, "I am terrified." When sorrow washes through the chest, the voice within announces, "I am broken." Consider the recursive anatomy of this psychological entanglement. What is the ego? It is not an enemy, nor is it an evil spirit to be vanquished. The ego is simply a sophisticated, bioevolutionary construct, a narrative tapestry woven from memories, survival instincts, social conditionings, and physical sensations. It is the mental machinery designed to navigate physical survival. How does the trap close around consciousness? When a sensory stimulus triggers an old survival pattern, the ego generates a corresponding cascade of thoughts and visceral sensations. Because the light of human awareness has been trained to fuse completely with mental content, the observer collapses into the phenomenon. The witness becomes the victim of the display. If a person says, "I am anxious," they have welded their very identity to a temporary neurochemical event. The conscious mind now mobilizes all its resources to defend, justify, or frantically resolve the anxiety. This defensive struggle pours biological energy directly into the disturbance, keeping the storm alive long after its natural life cycle should have ended. The key to liberation lies in a recursive inquiry. Who is the one that knows the storm is raging? When the heart hammers against the ribs, there is the physical sensation of the pulse, and there is the silent, neutral awareness that perceives the pounding. When a bitter thought crosses the mind, there is the sentence formed of electrical impulses, and there is the spacious witness recognizing the thought. The witness is not in pain. The witness is not panicking. The witness is the open sky across which the mental weather moves. The moment awareness disentangles itself from the content of the storm and rests in the identity of the sky, the machinery of suffering loses its fuel. In the late summer of 1971, inside an austere, whitewashed room of a psychiatric clinic outside Kyoto, a 40-year-old mathematician named Kenji Sato sat cross-legged on a woven tatami mat. Kenji was a man consumed by an uncontrollable, burning fury. 2 years earlier, a catastrophic academic dispute had stripped him of his university chair and his life's research on nonlinear differential equations. Every waking hour, Kenji replayed the faces of his colleagues, the falsified committee reports, and the humiliation of packing his library into cardboard boxes. His rage was not a concept, it was a physical fire. His teeth were worn flat from nocturnal grinding, his systolic blood pressure soared to dangerous heights, and the veins along his temples bulged like twisted twine. He had tried meditation, Stoic philosophy, and intense physical exertion, yet every effort to suppress the fury only seemed to feed its flames. A senior physician, Dr. Hideo Tanida, sat opposite him on the mat, pouring green tea from a cast iron pot with deliberate, unhurried precision. "Kenji," the doctor said, setting the iron pot down without a sound. "Bring the betrayal into this room right now. Call up the face of the dean who signed the order. Let the anger rise to its highest pitch." Kenji did not hesitate. Within seconds, his skin turned crimson. His hands balled into white-knuckled fists on his knees. His breath came in short, raspy gasps, and a low, guttural vibration hummed in his chest. He looked at the doctor with eyes wild with hostility. "Now," Dr. Tanida said, his voice dropping into a deep, steady cadence that seemed to anchor the entire room. "Do not push it away. Do not analyze it. Close your eyes and answer me. Who is the one aware that Kenji is furious?" Kenji opened his mouth to spit an answer, but the question arrested his cognitive loop. His intellect, primed for argument and defense, found nothing to grasp. The question was not asking why he was angry, nor how to stop being angry. It was pointing directly at the location of the observer. For 10 agonizing seconds, the silence stretched between them. Kenji looked inward, searching for the observer. He felt the heat in his neck, the pressure in his skull, the bile in his throat. But as he looked for the one noticing these sensations, a profound, spatial separation opened within his consciousness. There was the heat, there was the pounding heart, there was the memory of the betrayal, and then, sitting completely behind those phenomena, was a cool, silent, expansive awareness that was entirely free of heat. It was not angry, it was not seeking revenge, it was merely observing the phenomenon of Kenji's rage with the gentle detachment of a tree watching the wind bend its leaves. A single tear cut through the flushed skin of Kenji's cheek. The fists on his knees slowly unclenched, his fingers softening against the straw mat. The physiological storm was still present, but he was no longer drowning in it. He was standing on the shore, watching the dark waves break and recede. The breakthrough experienced by Kenji Sato demonstrates the profound operational mechanics of the observer state. Resistance is the only force that sustains internal conflict. When an individual fights an emotion, demanding that grief be replaced by gratitude, or that fear be conquered by sheer willpower, they are attempting to dry a wet floor with a damp cloth. The act of resistance is itself a declaration of war, and war generates the precise vibrational frequency of lack and struggle. The practice of the untouchable witness requires no exhausting mental gymnastics. It is a posture of radical, courageous non-interference. When a dense emotion arises in the course of a day, the practical shift is deceptively simple. One immediately drops the semantic pronoun I. The mind ceases to say, "I am terrified," and instead reports the biological reality with neutral precision. Fear is currently moving through this nervous system, and I am the conscious space in which it appears. In that simple shift of perspective, the emotional charge is deprived of the identification that feeds it. Left alone in the open sky of neutral awareness, without the ego rushing in to build a narrative or mount a defense, the biological half-life of an emotional wave is remarkably brief. The neurochemicals flood the bloodstream, peak, and naturally metabolize within 90 seconds. What remains after the storm clears is not exhaustion, but an extraordinary, concentrated clarity. The individual is no longer an accidental passenger thrown about by the chaotic currents of subconscious conditioning. They have stepped behind the wheel of awareness. Yet how does one take this silent witnessing presence and apply it to the chaotic friction of modern daily life? How does an individual hold this uncorrupted, sovereign frequency when the external world is screaming for a reaction, and the old habits of the nervous system are begging to pull the soul back into the storm? The midday sun glares through the plate glass window of a crowded train terminal, slicing through airborne dust and the gray steam rising from espresso machines. The terminal is a dense labyrinth of sensory friction. The screech of steel wheels against iron rails. The rhythmic, metallic clatter of the departures board flipping letters every 10 seconds. And the jostling of bodies encased in heavy wool coats. A traveler stands near the central pillar, holding a leather briefcase whose brass lock has sprung open. A stranger, rushing for the 12:15 express, collides violently with his right shoulder. The briefcase drops. Papers spill across the damp stone floor, sliding through dirty puddles of melted snow and crushed paper cups. The stranger does not stop, offering only an angry, dismissive curse thrown over a retreating shoulder. Observe the human instrument in this precise microsecond. The sympathetic nervous system ignites like a fuse. Norepinephrine floods the bloodstream. The carotid arteries throb against the collar, the hands curl into tight claws, the vocal cords tighten, primed to scream an obscenity into the crowd. The mind prepares to plunge headlong into the familiar cascade of grievance, retaliation, and wounded pride. Then, a single, deliberate friction occurs within the machinery. The man does not shout. He does not drop to his knees in frantic panic. Instead, he draws his heels together, lets his arms hang straight down, and pulls a slow, 4-second stream of cool air through his nostrils, sending it deep beneath his navel. He arrests the entire biological momentum. His eyes do not follow the retreating stranger. They soften, unhooking from the external chaos and resting on the neutral gray grain of the station pillar. The terminal continues to roar around him, but he has stepped off the moving train of automatic reaction. He stands entirely still, holding an invisible boundary between the stimulus and his soul. Why does a mere 60 seconds of conscious stillness possess the power to dismantle decades of conditioned suffering? To understand this biological threshold, one must examine the precise temporal mechanics of the human nervous system. When an individual encounters a sharp provocation or a sudden wave of panic, the amygdala initiates an automated biochemical cascade. It takes roughly 60 seconds for that initial surge of adrenaline and cortisol to circulate through the vascular tree and begin its natural enzymatic breakdown in the liver. When the human mind latches onto the provocation by replaying the insult, plotting a defense, or drowning in catastrophic projections, it constantly retriggers the alarm centers of the brain. Every angry thought fires a fresh electrical signal, dumping a new wave of stress hormones into the blood. The individual remains trapped in a state of chronic biological friction, not because of the original event, but because their own mental commentary continuously restarts the biochemical clock. The 60-second hold is a surgical interruption of this recursive loop, moving through 4 precise internal movements within a single minute. During the first 15 seconds, the practitioner makes no attempt to feel peaceful or manufacture artificial positivity. They simply anchor awareness directly in the physical body, feeling the raw visceral heat, the pounding pulse, and the tight constriction of the throat, without attaching a single word or judgment to the experience. In the next 15 seconds, an internal inquiry dissolves the automatic narrative. What am I accepting as truth in this moment? This simple, silent question acts as an immediate solvent on the subconscious assumptions of helplessness, lack, or victimhood that usually take root during a crisis. From the 30th to the 45th second, the field of attention widens into pure witnessing. The individual observes the physical sensations with the calm, detached curiosity of a naturalist watching weather move across an open sea, recognizing that the sensations are merely moving through the biological vessel. In the final 15 seconds, the nervous system enters an unforced coherence. The old neural pathway, being deprived of reactive identification, fails to complete its circuit, and the conditioned biological storm dissolves. In just 60 seconds of uncorrupted witnessing presence, the internal broadcast permanently shifts from a desperate plea for survival to the calm authority of sovereign awareness. In the autumn of 1968, inside an uninsulated radio transmission bunker outside Oslo, a telegraphist named Henrik Lind was responsible for monitoring naval emergency frequencies during a period of intense northern sea storms. Henrik was a man whose nervous system had been ground down by years of high-stakes isolation. His workspace smelled of ozone, scorched vacuum tubes, and stale black coffee. Pressure in the bunker was immense. A missed distress signal could mean the loss of an entire trawler crew in the freezing waters of the Norwegian Sea. On a night when gale-force winds howled against the concrete bunker and rattled the iron antenna mast, a high-voltage surge short-circuited the primary transmitter. A shower of white-hot sparks cascaded over Henrik's desk, igniting a sheaf of logbooks and knocking out the main receiver. The alarm siren began its deafening, oscillating shriek. Henrik's training dictated panic. Grab the manual fire extinguisher, clear the flaming debris, switch to the manual rotary generator, and re-establish the emergency beacon within 90 seconds or risk total communication blackout. His body moved into the ancient animal frenzy. His lungs gasped for air, his vision tunneled until he could see only the flames, and his hands shook so violently that he dropped the brass master key onto the concrete floor among the burning papers. He fell to his knees in the smoke, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer, on the verge of total cognitive collapse. Then Henrik remembered the instruction of an old Arctic sea captain who had survived 40 winters in the ice. When the ship is in the trough of the wave, do not touch the wheel for 60 seconds. Let the wood find its own balance. Henrik pulled his hands back from the floor. He sat flat on his heels amid the swirling gray smoke, closed his eyes, and let the siren scream into his ears without offering internal resistance. For 60 slow, deliberate seconds, he refused to move. He did not search for the key. He did not calculate the lives at risk. He placed his attention entirely upon the icy air entering his nostrils and the steady beat of his own heart. He allowed the total weight of the crisis to exist without becoming its victim. At the 45th second, the frantic shaking in his hands ceased. His peripheral vision returned. When he opened his eyes at the end of that unyielding minute, the room was no longer a chaotic nightmare. It was a clear physical problem with a direct sequence of solutions. He saw the corner of the brass key gleaming beneath the leg of the metal table, entirely safe from the fire. Moving with the smooth, unhurried precision of an artisan, Henrik extinguished the flames with a heavy wool blanket, retrieved the key, engaged the auxiliary battery banks, and restored the naval distress channel, with 12 seconds to spare. The external catastrophe had not changed, but the internal instrument navigating it had moved from blindness to absolute mastery. The victory in Henrik Lind's bunker reveals the profound truth of human transformation. Mastery is not found in avoiding the crisis, but in claiming the 60-second space between impact and reaction. Every day presents 100 opportunities to enter this sanctuary. It occurs when a sharp word is spoken across a dinner table, when a bank statement reveals an unexpected deficit, or when a sudden wave of unworthiness washes through the chest during an ordinary afternoon. These moments are not interruptions to spiritual development, they are the exact raw material through which the nervous system is rebuilt. When an individual chooses to hold neutral, sovereign awareness for 60 seconds instead of tumbling into the ancient reflex of defense or despair, they are performing an act of profound, neurological and spiritual alchemy. They are proving to their biology that consciousness, not circumstance, commands the state of the being. To walk this path is to leave behind the noisy marketplace of superficial techniques and enter the quiet domain of genuine inner authority. If this exploration of consciousness has opened an authentic doorway in your understanding, and you feel called to deepen this living practice alongside a community of discerning minds, consider taking a moment now to subscribe, leave your reflection, and share this work with those who are ready to move beyond theory and step into embodied mastery. For once, the 60-second sanctuary becomes an established sanctuary within the human heart, an extraordinary transition takes place. The individual stops visiting peace as an occasional tourist and begins to dwell within it as a sovereign creator. What remains is to step fully into this transformed state to discover what life looks like when the internal war has permanently ceased and reality begins to rearrange itself around a consciousness that can no longer be shaken. Dawn breaks across the valley not with a sudden flare of trumpets, but with a slow, quiet seep of cool, pearlescent light. The mist sits low over the damp grass, wrapping the bases of ancient walnut trees in soft, translucent ribbons. The air smells of wet slate, cold loam, and the sharp, clean sweetness of wild mint crushed underfoot. A figure steps onto the gravel path outside the stone cottage. The morning air bites at the exposed skin of the neck, yet the shoulders do not rise in defense. The hands rest loosely at the sides, fingers uncurled, the skin warm despite the frost silvering the edges of the flagstones. Notice what is missing from this morning. There is no urgent reach for a notebook to record 500 affirmations before the sun climbs. There is no frantic positioning before a mirror to command the facial muscles into a synthetic mask of prosperity. The breath moves easily through the diaphragm, deep and rhythmic, entering and departing without the subtle hitch of chronic anxiety that had held the ribcage in an iron corset for 20 years. The traveler looks upon the landscape not as an adversary to be conquered, nor as an empty canvas waiting to be aggressively painted with the demands of an insecure ego. The valley simply exists, complete in its dew and quietude. A sparrow lands on the iron gatepost 6 paces away, tilts its head, and takes flight without haste. The watcher does not extract a prophetic meaning or search for a cosmic sign. Awareness rests in the sheer, unforced reality of the present. The desperate hunger to become someone else has dissolved into the stillness of being here. Why does external reality soften and align the moment an individual ceases the desperate effort to control it? The human intellect has been conditioned to view the material world as an unyielding, petrified forest through which one must force a path with continuous mental exertion. The recursive trap of the seeker is to ask, how do I push this stubborn circumstance until it yields? This inquiry is born of a foundational optical illusion. Reality is not a solid, immovable block resisting conscious intent. It is an extraordinarily fluid, responsive medium, a living ocean of resonance that mirrors the foundational baseline of the consciousness perceiving it. When an individual operates from the chronic assumption of lack, reality behaves with absolute, rigid obstinacy. The resistance experienced in the external world is not the world's native property. It is the precise reflection of the internal friction generated by a mind at war with the present. Every frantic demand, every white-knuckled attempt to force an outcome, broadcasts the unmistakable signal of separation. It is not here, therefore I must fight. The field responds to that energetic signature with mathematical precision, producing more circumstances that validate the necessity of struggle. What occurs when the fight is permanently abandoned? When consciousness settles into the sovereign witness, the internal friction drops to zero. The observer stops projecting fear and scarcity onto the field. In the absence of that distorting broadcast, the natural intelligence of the whole begins to reorganize the field around coherence. Obstacles that once seemed permanent dissolve not because they were shattered by force, but because the perceptual lens generating their necessity has vanished. The world ceases to be a wall pushing back against desire, and becomes what it has always been, a fluid mirror reflecting the quiet authority of an integrated mind. In the spring of 1934, in a sunlit stone studio overlooking the hills of Fiesole, an elderly master woodcarver named Matteo Rossi was commissioned to restore a 16th-century walnut altarpiece that had warped and cracked through centuries of neglect. 3 younger craftsmen had already attempted the restoration and failed. Each had approached the brittle, twisted wood with heavy iron clamps, boiling steam boxes, and hydraulic presses, attempting to force the warped timber back into its original true plane. With every application of pressure, the ancient walnut had groaned, splintered, and fractured deeper along its internal grain. Matteo arrived carrying no heavy machinery. His leather tool roll contained only a few bone scrapers, a jar of cold-pressed linseed oil, and a pair of worn wooden mallets. For 7 days, Matteo did not touch a single tool to the wood. He sat on a low 3-legged stool in the center of the studio, resting his palms upon the warped panel, feeling the cold contours of the timber beneath his fingers. He observed the natural flow of the grain, the deep fissures where the wood had shrunk in dry seasons, and the subtle curves where it had absorbed moisture from ancient rains. His breathing was slow and unhurried. His eyes were completely devoid of the restless ambition that had driven the younger carvers to ruin the timber. Matteo, his apprentice asked on the 6th afternoon, his voice tight with impatience. "Why do you waste the client's time? The wood must be bent into shape before the summer heat ruins it." Matteo looked up, his weathered face calm and serene. "The wood is not your enemy, Marco. It is not trying to be crooked, it is merely resting where the forces of 400 winters have placed it. If you fight its history, it will break your heart and shatter your tools." On the 8th morning, Matteo began his work. He did not force the wood against its grain. He made microscopic, sovereign incisions along the stress lines, releasing centuries of trapped internal tension with strokes so delicate they made no sound in the quiet studio. He rubbed oil deep into the parched fibers, allowing the wood to drink without resistance. Under his calm, patient presence, the walnut softened. Without the violent pressure of iron clamps or steam, the twisted panel settled back into its true alignment, the ancient grain locking together with such seamless perfection that the seams became invisible to the human eye. The restoration was not a victory over the wood, it was the natural outcome of a craftsman who refused to generate resistance. The mastery of Matteo Rossi illustrates the ultimate realization of the conscious creator. Reality does not yield to violence, but to stillness. The journey that began before the flaking mirror in Chapter 1, where the voice was raspy from repeating empty words, and the nervous system was clenched in survival, has reached its natural conclusion. The seeker does not need to cross an infinite desert to find wholeness. Wholeness was never absent. It was merely obscured by the manic effort to manufacture it. The 60-second sanctuary is not a technique to be practiced once and discarded. It is the living threshold through which one steps out of the frantic machinery of the ego and enters sovereign reality. From this moment forward, the path is uncomplicated. When the world presents a sudden shock, the sovereign consciousness pauses. It takes a single, unhurried breath. It drops the demand for the moment to be different than it is. It holds the pure, uncorrupted frequency of the witness for 60 seconds, allowing the biological storm to clear and the responsive field to settle into balance. Living from this centered awareness, life is no longer a desperate campaign to manifest a future of imagined peace. Peace is the ground upon which each step is placed. The sovereign reality is already present, waiting only for the quiet courage of the observer to see it, to claim it, and to walk forward without a single backward glance.